The Pirates acquired Rowdy Tellez to play some first base this season, but how will he and likely someone else manage the position for the Pittsburgh Pirates in 2024?
You are Locked On Pirates, your daily Pittsburgh Pirates podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome back, everybody, to the Locked On Pirates podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team, your Pittsburgh Pirates every day. My name is Ethan Smith. You can follow me on Twitter right there at MVP_Ethan or at Locked On Pirates for all of your news, analysis, opinions, and reactions to everything going on in the world of the Pittsburgh Pirates. And right now, we're still in the middle of the 2024 player preview series, and it's all about first base today. And for now, when you are discussing first base for the Pittsburgh Pirates, that conversation has to start with Rowdy Tellez, who was an outside acquisition for the Pirates this offseason. And a lot of people, especially because of the timing of it, there was a lot of other big signings that were happening, like Shohei Ohtani and Yoshi going to the Dodgers and Juan Soto going to the Yankees. There was a lot of stuff going on around that period of time when Rowdy Tellez signed with the Pittsburgh Pirates. So the move didn't really get a lot of praise, really. It also wasn't really anything for me, at least as a Pirates fan, that said, oh, this is a game-changing move. It was something that, yeah, the Pirates need somebody to come in and play first base and be a power option at that position. Tellez has shown that in his time at the big leagues. Of course, 2022 being his most recent really good season and probably the best season that he's ever had. He had 35 home runs in 2022 while ranking in the 85th percentile or higher, folks, in expected slugging, average exit velocity, and barrel percentage. So he was just having a crazy year in 2022, and his OPS was also a 767 in that season, while also having the most plate appearances he's had in a season by a country mile. I mean, if you go look at his baseball card, you'll see that Rowdy Tellez in 2022, that was his year. 2022 was indeed the year of Rowdy Tellez in Milwaukee, and trust me, as Pirates fans, we remember Rowdy Tellez being a thorn in the side of the Pittsburgh Pirates in 2022. And his OPS was also a 767 in that season. I already said that, but again, that's a number that I want you guys to keep in your head. Now, he's coming off a 2023 campaign with Milwaukee that otherwise he'd probably largely like to forget. And there was just not a lot last season that you can really look back on from Tellez and say, yeah, this was a good season for him. It just wasn't a good season or like for him. And ultimately, it's a season that we've seen out of Tellez before. And 2022, again, is also a season we've seen out of Tellez before. He only had 13 home runs last year with a 667 OPS. He also didn't rank higher than the 77th percentile in any hitting statistic last year. That is just... it's not something you really want to see, especially when he played in less games. Usually those percentiles can get a little bit amplified. You'll kind of hear me talk about that a little bit when we're discussing one of his platoon candidate options potentially. And the deal with Tellez, I think, is pretty apparent. He's a masher who has massive home run potential, but can he get back to it? That's something that I think a lot of people are asking about this signing. Is something that Tellez can get back to? Is this a player that can regain his 2022 form for the Pittsburgh Pirates and be that plus power type of guy? And through some research for this show, Fangraphs also believes they have a curse on Rowdy Tellez. They call it the Fangraphs Rowdy Tellez curse. Go read that article for yourself. It's very good. It was written actually a few days ago, and it was a very good article. And there was some stuff to find in it too that I think is very noteworthy to discuss when you're discussing a guy like Rowdy Tellez and if he can regain his form from 2022. And he was largely doing that in the early part of the year last year. And he has to bring back his patient approach. That is the approach that he's always been best with, is when he is taking the pitches that he can't do anything with and he's slamming the ones that he can. And last season through May 30th, per Fangraphs, Tellez had a 12.2% walk rate in 49 games with 12 home runs and a 123 WRC plus. Those are numbers that showcase that what he did in 2022, he was largely doing at the beginning of the season last year. Now, when you get into the end of the year, from May 31st to the end of the campaign, which also saw the addition of Carlos Santana into the mix, in 57 games, the 12.2% walk rate dropped to 7.6, and he was the worst National League hitter in the league with a 31 WRC plus. So yeah, a drop off for sure. I mean, those are two different players at that point. You would think if I was telling you that I would be talking about two largely different guys. And keep in mind, I think he only hit like one home run from May 31st to the end of the year. Now, I mentioned the injury earlier, and this is something that he's even been open about, is that he had forearm inflammation around the summertime last year, and he's quoted as saying that injury lingered all season for him. So is that something that you could expect as a reason why he was not performing as well? But I go back to that patience that I talked about, and Tellez again is a very patient hitter. That's when he's at his best, is when he's taking pitches, and he's going to strike out. He just is. That's just something he's going to do. But when he's being patient at the plate, that's when he's at his best. So even Fangraphs said this, and I agreed with it. You would think that his swing and miss rate or swing rate would go down if he was having forearm issues, but it went up. So in a way, he kind of hurt himself and hurt his production, especially if it was something that was lingering. But Fangraphs also agrees with what I want to see from Tellez, which is taking more pitches he flat out can't hit or do anything with and blasting the ones that he can. And if you're a Pittsburgh Pirates fan and listen to the show every day, doesn't that sound familiar to a certain center fielder on this roster that we'll talk about in the player preview series soon? Yeah, it does. Now, Tellez is a 3 common outcome player. So for people that might not know that, if they're listening to the show or getting into baseball for the first time, 3 common outcomes player. You see a lot of them nowadays. It's either home run, walk, or strikeout. That's usually all you're going to ever really see. But you obviously will see other things. But more often than not, those are going to be the 3 outcomes that you'll see from a player like Tellez. But rekindling that double-digit walk rate that I talked about that he had early on in the year at 12.2, and bringing that strike rate down, sorry, can't speak, to at least 20%, which is what it was from in 2022, would go very far for his success. And last year, you also look at other things that just didn't work out for him. His barrel rate drastically dropped. Another metric that for a guy like Tellez is going to be very, very important. He is a plus power hit first baseman. That's just what Tellez is going to be. And he might play a little bit of first base. I think he will, probably, based off of the options that the Pirates currently have right now. And he's going to DH too. Andrew McCutchen cannot DH every day anymore. I just don't think it's something he can do. Now, if Tellez, and this is just a fun factoid before we get into the platoon options for Rowdy Tellez at first base, if Tellez starts at first base on opening day, and this reigns true for a potential platoon mate with him if they decide to DH him on opening day, which I don't know what they'll do there, he would become the 13th different player to start at first base on opening day since 2009 for this team. The 13th different player at first base to start on opening day at first base since 2009 for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, who are the options to play alongside Tellez, and who would I like to most see? We'll talk about that in the second and third segment of today's episode today, which is brought to you by FanDuel. But we're also going to talk about eBay Motors. Millions of parts for your MVP. You can win every time with parts that fit your ride, because passion, drive, and patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy, and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. And folks, also don't forget that Locked On has launched the first ever National Sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now you can also find it on Amazon Fire TV. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On like myself, plus our national shows covering every league. Find the Locked On Sports Today channel now on Amazon Fire TV and YouTube. Now, folks, I'm going to get right into it. I don't think you need a rocket scientist really to tell you that Rowdy Tellez is not a plus defensive player. If you've never watched him play, just get used to that. He's not going to be a gold glove caliber first baseman like we saw last season with Carlos Santana. And I don't think I really need to discuss his defense all that much further, just because I do think his offense is going to obviously be what dictates if he has a strong 2024 or not. But what that does mean is that likely a platoon will be in order at the position. And with free agent candidates at first base now limited, especially after the aforementioned Carlos Santana signed, I think it's time to look in-house for what the Pirates have at their disposal. And I really think it just boils down to three players, who two especially, but the third I think has to be mentioned just because he's done it before. And I think it's a possibility. Those three, of course, being Jared Triolo, Connor Joe, and Yasmani Grandal. Now, any platoon conversation that you're having right now, as long as it's not about the outfield, if it's in the infield or anything about that as far as a utility player in the infield goes, I think you have to start that conversation with Jared Triolo right now, who became a utility player for this team last year and a pretty good one for the Pirates after, Ke'Bryan Hayes was dealing with his injuries. You had second base become a big question with like Peguero and Gonzalez and guys like that not really performing all that well. Obviously, Triolo played a little bit of first base too. And he finished the season impressively, not only defensively, of course, with his 5 outs above average and 3 fielding run value, but his bat was pretty good last year as well. Now, albeit only in 209 plate appearances in about 54 games. And you come back from that season, or you come out of that season, and you look at what Triolo did. He had a 786 OPS. And again, I already mentioned a plus 5 outs above average, 12 batting run value. If he brings back that same production, you have to play him. I mean, he would be one of the best players in the National League if he's hitting 298 again with a 780 or 86 OPS and playing the defense that he has. Now, the big story about this is going deeper into the stats and looking at the fact that Triolo's expected batting average was 254. So, yeah, there was some luck involved in his statistics last year, and really a lot of that became me saying that he was lucky comes from the fact because he wasn't hitting the ball that hard. But again, his defense is very valuable. And I've already said it on this show. If he gets ample enough playing time, I think he will be a finalist for the Utility Gold Glove Award this year. I don't even think that's in the question or out of the question at all. Now, when you're talking about Triolo in first base, he did in fact play a little bit of it last year. He got to play 7 games at first base last year. He logged 52 and a thirds innings with 53 putouts and 5 assists. So he proved, at least in a short stint, in a short period of time, that he could perform well there. Now, again, it's hard to expect that he's going to match his 2023 production offensively. But even if he has that expected batting average of 254, while also being a plus defensive player and maybe adding some power, which I think is something we should all be looking out for from Jared Triolo, I think first base makes sense as an option for him. And I don't think there's any reason why it shouldn't. And he's probably the front runner right now. But there are two other, or at least one other guy, or two, depending on what you want to really consider about it, that can also play this position and have played it for much longer. And one of those guys, of course, is Connor Joe, who played 4 different positions for Pittsburgh last year, including 343 and 2/3 innings of first base. And by the way, before we get into this, I'm loving this part of my mustache that I have that just wants to keep getting in the way of my mouth. I think it's great. I hope you guys enjoy that, me fidgeting around with my face all day. Um, but you look at Connor Joe, and he's still here. A lot of people thought he might be a trade candidate this offseason. There's still time for that. Don't get me wrong. There's still time for that. And some people were wondering really what his role was going to be going into this year. He had a 997 fielding percentage last year. That's great. And that was at first base. But more importantly, I think was his 31 assists and 37 turn double plays that made him very noteworthy at that position. Now, he also had the most homers he's had in the past 3 years. Last year with 11, and he was elite with a low chase rate at the plate. We know the type of player that Connor Joe is. That's just who he's always going to be. He's going to be a guy that is not going to chase pitches out of the zone. Sometimes he'll get caught on the corners, and that's why you see that strikeout rate be a little bit high. But that ultimately is what ends up happening with a guy like Connor Joe. And he also was just a plus defender all around. I mean, he had a 2 outs above average and a 3 fielding run value. So really you could stick him wherever you want to put him. He was a DH last year. He played a lot of first base. He played a good bit of right field. He played a good bit even of left field last season when Brian Reynolds was needed off days or anything. Joe would be kind of the guy that would do that. Now, I do believe that a guy like Connor Joe, I do believe that his ability to move between the corner outfield spots and first base gives him a good shot to platoon here. But I do think that there's a lot of this decision that's going to be dictated by other things. What happens in right field for the Pirates? Does Joshua Palacios or Edward Olivares really take over that position? What happens at second base? Do Peguero and or Gonzalez or even Triolo take over that position? And if no one cements themselves as a bona fide starter at those positions, I think it gets kind of interesting. And I also wouldn't rule out Connor Joe playing a little bit of second base if things go a little bit awry there also. Now, I'd say if, let's say, Peguero and Olivares do cement themselves, though, and Jared Triolo is performing well and bouncing back from the season that he had last year, I think that leaves Joe in an interesting spot because what do you really do with him at that point? Is he just a backup outfielder? If he is, then that's fine. Is he just a backup first baseman on days where Triolo might need a day off? Then sure. If that's really what the consensus ends up being at the end of the day. But then there's Yasmani Grandal, who I know you guys are probably like, why is he even mentioning this guy? And we spoke about it yesterday. You guys absolutely love that show with me and Gary. And obviously, Grandal is a primary catcher and likely the primary backup this year. I think that's why they brought him in. But he has played 669 and a third innings of first base over his career. Now, I would say that he is the least likely option of these three to platoon alongside Rowdy Tellez. I just don't think that Grandal has ever been a plus defender, at least not consistently. There have been years where he was an elite blocker behind the plate, but he's never done it consistently. His big thing is pitch framing. That's always what Yasmani Grandal is going to do. And also, he's at 35. He's a 35-year-old guy now, and you may see Grandal play first if things are going really bad over there, but at best, he's an emergency first base option. But I do think it's warranted to mention him. I mean, he's played a ton of that position across his career, and it's something that if it does happen, it wouldn't shock me. But if you also watched Yasmani Grandal play last year at the age of 35, I think it'd be best for him to just stay behind the plate and catch and maybe DH in a few spots. But at the end of the day as well, I think you have to consider that the Pirates do have options at first base to platoon alongside Rowdy Tellez, and they do have the idea that they could go out and find an acquisition elsewhere if they want to. So those are the three options, but who do I think the Pirates ultimately go with? We'll talk about that in the final segment of today's episode, but before we do, we're going to talk about FanDuel. Folks, FanDuel, of course, is your one place to do all your sports betting this year because new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 winning bet at FanDuel.com/locked on because you can get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet that wins. That's $150 if your bet wins. You can bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and more. So just visit fanduel.com/locked on and shoot your shot today because FanDuel is an official sportsbook partner of the NBA and an official sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. And folks, welcome to the third and final segment of today's episode of Locked On Pirates here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Tomorrow's show, we're going to be talking all about second base. It's going to be very fun. Later in the week, we're going to have O'Neal Cruz and Ke'Bryan Hayes as the center points on their own episodes as the 2024 player preview series continues on and kind of maybe gets to a close here pretty soon because pitchers and catchers report tomorrow, which is also going to be very, very fun. You guys may get an extra episode tomorrow where I talk about some things that I am excited to see from pitchers and catchers reporting. But I've talked about the options now. Rowdy Tellez, obviously going to be a guy that plays there. I've talked about Jared Triolo. I've talked about Connor Joe. I've talked about even Yasmani Grandal. Now, Fangraphs, who I use a lot to look at depth charts and projections, has the 2024 projected first baseman being Tellez. No shocker. With Grandal and Joe on the bench and Triolo starting in the minors. Now, this is a possibility. I don't want to rule it out and say that this is just flat out stupid because it's not. This is a possibility that can happen. Triolo still has minor league options. He has no true place on the field right now because now with O'Neal Cruz and Ke'Bryan Hayes back, that takes out two of his usual spots that he was platooning in. Now, obviously, he could do those things on those guys' days off. But then what happens if Peguero, Gonzalez, or Bay really takes over second base? Then he really only has to play at first base. And he can't send Connor Joe back down because he doesn't have any more options. So it is reasonable that there are some things that are going to happen this year. Connor Joe, it's reasonable to say, could take a step back in his production. He's entering his age 32 year. Triolo, meanwhile, is 26. It's also reasonable to say that Triolo could take a step back in his production. But he does still have plenty of time to continue growing as a player and has shown, again, in a small sample size that he can handle the first base position. Now, my big thing about Jared Triolo potentially starting in AAA is that I just don't think it would really teach him anything. But these are also the decisions that the Pirates are going to have to make at this point, at this stage of the rebuild. Nick Gonzalez might not even start on this opening day roster, folks, and he was a first-round pick 4 years ago. That's the state of this team right now. Jared Triolo is a guy who hit .298 with a .787 OPS over 200 plate appearances last year and likely could have been a Gold Glove finalist if he would have played the entire year and might not even be on this roster day one. That's the kind of roster that the Pirates are starting to slowly build up now. And then when you take a look at the other things too, I mean, Malcolm Nunez is still a question mark. He's a guy that is likely going to play a lot of first base at AAA this year, and I would not want Jared Triolo to take away from that because he's still a question mark. And I know that Malcolm Nunez is also a guy who has a lot of plus power and has been good before. And then you look at everybody else. You have guys like Josiah Seitler. Shout out to you, sir, for being on this show. Seth Beer. Will Matheson. I mean, there's a lot of different guys there, but none of them are really ready except outside of Seth Beer, who's at least had a minimal amount of MLB experience. So I do think that Jared Triolo will be on the opening day roster alongside Connor Joe and Yasmani Grandal, because you know Grandal is going to be on this roster. Connor Joe, it gets interesting because then you're looking at an idea where you have guys like Palacios, you guys have guys like Olivares, you have guys like even Triolo that could keep him off this roster and make the Pirates have to make a very tough decision. Now, this will be a show idea that I'll do later in March, closer to opening day, where I'm projecting the opening day roster and rotation. But Triolo is, to me, at least right now, your best platoon option, especially defensively alongside Tellez. Now, I'm not saying again that Connor Joe can't do it because he has done it before, but he may need outfield time depending on what happens out there. Now, in a perfect world, Triolo's production offensively doesn't take a major step back and Tellez regains his 2022 form, then you have a very good dynamic going over there. But baseball isn't perfect again. You know that. It's an imperfect sport, which is what makes it so perfect. And having Triolo in the lineup will be something I think we see often, again, with his ability to play all four infield positions. But I would not be shocked, as I'm talking about it today, if first base is the one that he plays the most. And that's really where this all boils down to, is like, what player do you want alongside Tellez over there? Do the Pirates still go out and get another player to play first base? I think they really wanted Santana. He was just out of their price range, I'm fairly certain. And you look at the rest of the free agent options, and none of them are particularly great defensive players, but there are still options over there at first base. Pirates can take this a lot of different ways. So that's first base for you, though. Can Rowdy Tellez regain his past form? The tools are there for him to do it, to recap that. I mean, if he could just bring back his patient approach that he had in 2022 and early on in 2023, especially in PNC Park, Rowdy Tellez could hit 30 home runs this year. He has that kind of ceiling for this team, especially in that ballpark, being the left-handed power hitter that he is. And don't be shocked if he reminds you a lot of Pedro Alvarez either. I think that's a very warranted comparison for Tellez. Is I think he can be a Pedro Alvarez type player for this team, and that's not a bad thing at all. But the tools are there for him to do it. He's done it before. You've said it. I said this about Marco Gonzalez and Martin Perez. These are all guys that in 2022 were very good players and were good players beforehand too. They've done it before. The biggest question is, can they do it again? And is Jared Triolo the likeliest platoon option for him? Likely, yeah, but do not set that in stone and take it to the bank yet, because spring training hasn't even started yet. What if Connor Joe comes out and lights the world on fire and plays a lot of first base, and Jared Triolo is just an option behind everybody in the infield? It's a very big option. It's a very big thing that could happen. And on tomorrow's show, Triolo's name will come up again as we take a look at second base, which I think offers the most fun positional battle we'll see this spring. And also why the winner of that battle may create an interesting dilemma for the Pittsburgh Pirates moving forward. That'll all be on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pirates. But folks, one more sleep and pitchers and catchers are reporting. That's all you got to do is get through Tuesday, and pitchers and catchers will be in Bradenton, Florida before you know it. My name is Ethan Smith. You can follow me on Twitter at MVP_Ethan or at Locked On Pirates. Again, for all of your news, analysis, opinions, and reactions to everything going on in the world of the Pittsburgh Pirates. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Odyssey, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, and of course, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast, because it is free and available to you 5 days a week from now until the baseball season's over at this point. So, folks, thank you so much for tuning in on Tuesday, February 13th. Have a great rest of your day. See you on the flip side, and we're talking second base tomorrow, and man, am I excited.